The sun was just beginning to dip behind the tall pines as the troop of 15 scouts gathered in the parking lot, the cool evening air brushing against their faces. Their backpacks were packed tight, each scout with a tent, sleeping bag, and all the gear needed for a weekend of wilderness adventure. Laughter echoed through the lot as they joked and teased one another, the excitement of the trip palpable. This was their last camping trip before they all went their separate ways. And, for many, it felt like a rite of passage into adulthood. They were prepared for everything: campfires, ghost stories, and the thrill of the unknown. Scoutmaster Collins stood at the front, double-checking the list of supplies. A man in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the great outdoors. He was a beloved figure in the troop. His booming voice could always be heard over the chatter, but tonight it held a note of encouragement as he addressed the group. "All right, team, you all know the drill. We've got a long hike ahead, but it's nothing we can't handle. I want you all to stay together and keep your wits about you. The woods can be unpredictable." His tone was light, but the warning carried weight. "We'll set up camp in a couple of hours, and tomorrow we start our project. This is what we've been training for." The scouts nodded, some nervously shifting their weight, others eager to prove themselves. Among them was Aaron, the youngest of the group, who had only recently joined the troop. He was anxious but determined to leave a mark before the weekend was over. He watched the older scouts as they cracked jokes and swapped stories, wondering if he would ever truly fit in. Beside him was Daniel, his closest friend, a scout of 3 years who had been his guide through the initiation process. Daniel's face was lit with excitement, a wide grin stretching across his face as he adjusted his pack. "Think we'll see any wildlife?" Daniel asked, nudging Aaron as they started walking toward the trailhead. "Maybe some deer," Aaron replied, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The forest seemed so big, so open, and yet, in his heart, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The troop began their hike, the air growing cooler as the sun slipped lower in the sky. The path was narrow and winding, veering deeper into the forest with every step. The towering trees loomed above them, casting long shadows across the trail. The rhythmic crunch of boots on the dirt mixed with the soft whispers of the wind and the occasional call of a bird. By the time they had reached their intended campsite, it was nearly dark. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the branches, leaving everything bathed in a soft, golden hue. Collins, ever the experienced outdoorsman, immediately took charge. "Gather some firewood," he instructed. "Get the tents up and make sure everything is secured for the night." The scouts worked together with practiced ease, pitching tents and setting up the campfire. As the last of the tents were staked into place, Collins nodded in approval and began working on the fire pit. The crackling of dry wood soon filled the air as the fire took hold, casting a warm, flickering light that pushed back the creeping darkness. The troop gathered around, settling into their usual roles. The older scouts took their places on the logs, leaning back with ease as they shared stories, while Aaron and the others sat at the edge, feeling both included and distant. The air was thick with the scent of pine and fresh earth, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. It was the perfect camping night, the kind that they would talk about for years, the kind of night that should have been filled with laughter and tales of past trips. But there was a strange stillness in the air, a quiet that felt almost unnatural. Aaron couldn't quite place it, but as he sat by the fire, his mind kept drifting back to the woods surrounding them. It felt as if something was just out of sight, waiting. As the night wore on, Collins gave the usual instructions. "Make sure the camp is secure. No wandering off alone, and most importantly, stay close to the fire." The stars had begun to dot the sky above, and the fire's glow was the only light for miles. Despite the warnings, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He stared into the flickering flames, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing in on him. It was then that the quiet first took hold. Not the kind of silence you expect in the woods, but an unsettling hush that seemed to stretch through the camp, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. But the scouts didn't notice. For them, it was just another night in the wilderness. They had no way of knowing that the peace of this night would be the last for many of them. The next day they would be gone, lost to the forest, with no trace of where they had gone or why, and what was waiting for them deep in the heart of the wilderness had no intention of letting them return. The morning broke over the forest with a strange stillness. The sky was a washed-out blue, clouded with an early fog that clung to the ground like a blanket. The camp was still, save for the soft rustling of the trees as the wind began to stir. The scouts, bleary-eyed from the cold night, slowly began to wake. There was no rush. They had the whole day ahead of them, just another day in the woods. The fire from the night before had long since died out, leaving behind only embers and the remnants of charred wood. Aaron stretched his arms, his muscles sore from the hike yesterday. His pack was still neatly by his side, and the smell of wet earth was already rising with the morning fog. He shuffled over to the edge of the camp, where a few other scouts were already gathering firewood. The stillness of the morning hadn't shaken from him the feeling of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, but something about the woods felt different. Today, the air was too thick, too quiet. He couldn't pinpoint what was off, but every time his eyes scanned the horizon, his pulse quickened. Scoutmaster Collins was already on his feet, calling for everyone to gather around the campfire to discuss the day's plans. His voice, steady and commanding, helped bring some semblance of order to the group. The scouts gathered around, forming a loose circle, the fog curling around their legs like an omen. "All right, team," Collins began. "Today we're hiking deeper into the forest. I've mapped out a new trail. We'll head east and stop for lunch by the river, then return here by nightfall." He paused, scanning the group. "Stay together. The forest may seem calm, but things can change fast out here. No one should wander off. Got it?" The scouts nodded, some more enthusiastically than others, their packs already slung over their shoulders. The mood was one of routine. This was just another day in the wilderness. They didn't know that the trail ahead would mark the beginning of the end of their journey. The hike started like any other. The air was damp, and the fog clung to the trees in a way that made the world seem dim and distant. The trail they followed was narrow, cutting through dense foliage. The scouts, now more accustomed to the forest's eerie stillness, laughed and joked among themselves as they hiked. They were used to the sounds of birds and the occasional rustling of squirrels, but today the silence felt deeper. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional snap of a twig. By mid-morning, they had covered a fair distance, but as the group continued forward, something odd happened, something no one could immediately explain. The radio, which Collins had been using to check in with the ranger station, suddenly crackled and went dead. He frowned, twisting the dial as he tried to get a signal, but all that came through was static. "Must be some interference," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He attempted to call the station again, but the signal wouldn't return. The forest swallowed the sound of his voice, leaving only silence in its wake. Collins was no stranger to the unpredictable nature of the wilderness, but even he felt a creeping sense of unease. He checked the time on his watch, nearly noon. They should have been able to get a clear signal, especially in the middle of the day. He didn't mention his worries to the group. He didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. The scouts were too caught up in the hike to notice. Aaron, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The air had a strange weight to it, almost as though it was holding its breath. He glanced over at Daniel, but his friend was lost in conversation with another scout, laughing about something. The others were equally distracted, chatting and pointing out animal tracks or trying to spot birds in the trees. Collins called. A break at the riverbank as planned, and the scouts sat in the damp grass, resting and eating their packed lunches. He once again tried the radio, but there was nothing. The static hissed in his ears like an angry, unseen presence. His face hardened as he clicked off the radio, slipping it back into his pack. "We'll head back to camp soon," Collins said, his tone not quite as light as before. "Stick to the trail. Don't stray off. We'll make it back before sunset." The scouts nodded, but no one noticed the way Collins' eyes lingered on the trees, the way his fingers kept brushing against the compass at his waist. No one heard the soft crackling of leaves behind them, nor the strange chill that had begun to hang in the air. The silence deepened, and though the day carried on, it felt as if something had already changed in the woods. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the tall pines as the troop of 15 scouts gathered in the parking lot, the cool evening air brushing against their faces. Their backpacks were packed tight, each scout with a tent, sleeping bag, and all the gear needed for a weekend of wilderness adventure. Laughter echoed through the lot as they joked and teased one another, the excitement of the trip palpable. This was their last camping trip before they all went their separate ways, and, for many, it felt like a rite of passage into adulthood. They were prepared for everything: campfires, ghost stories, and the thrill of the unknown. Scoutmaster Collins stood at the front, double-checking the list of supplies. A man in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the great outdoors. He was a beloved figure in the troop. His booming voice could always be heard over the chatter, but tonight it held a note of encouragement as he addressed the group. "All right, team, you all know the drill. We've got a long hike ahead, but it's nothing we can't handle. I want you all to stay together and keep your wits about you. The woods can be unpredictable." His tone was light, but the warning carried weight. "We'll set up camp in a couple of hours, and tomorrow we start our project. This is what we've been training for." The scouts nodded, some nervously shifting their weight, others eager to prove themselves. Among them was Aaron, the youngest of the group, who had only recently joined the troop. He was anxious but determined to leave a mark before the weekend was over. He watched the older scouts as they cracked jokes and swapped stories, wondering if he would ever truly fit in. Beside him was Daniel, his closest friend, a scout of 3 years who had been his guide through the initiation process. Daniel's face was lit with excitement, a wide grin stretching across his face. As he adjusted his pack, "Think we'll see any wildlife?" Daniel asked, nudging Aaron as they started walking toward the trailhead. "Maybe some deer," Aaron replied, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The forest seemed so big, so open, and yet, in his heart, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The troop began their hike, the air growing cooler as the sun slipped lower in the sky. The path was narrow and winding, veering deeper into the forest with every step. The towering trees loomed above them, casting long shadows across the trail. The rhythmic crunch of boots on the dirt mixed with the soft whispers of the wind and the occasional call of a bird. By the time they had reached their intended campsite, it was nearly dark. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the branches, leaving everything bathed in a soft golden hue. Collins, ever the experienced outdoorsman, immediately took charge. "Gather some firewood," he instructed. "Get the tents up and make sure everything is secured for the night." The scouts worked together with practiced ease, pitching tents and setting up the campfire. As the last of the tents was staked into place, Collins nodded in approval and began working on the fire pit. The crackling of dry wood soon filled the air as the fire took hold, casting a warm, flickering light that pushed back the creeping darkness. The troop gathered around, settling into their usual roles. The older scouts took their places on the logs, leaning back with ease as they shared stories, while Aaron and the others sat at the edge, feeling both included and distant. The air was thick with the scent of pine and fresh earth, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. It was the perfect camping night, the kind that they would talk about for years. The kind of night that should have been filled with laughter and tales of past trips. But there was a strange stillness in the air, a quiet that felt almost unnatural. Aaron couldn't quite place it, but as he sat by the fire, his mind kept drifting back to the woods surrounding them. It felt as if something was just out of sight, waiting. As the night wore on, Collins gave the usual instructions. Make sure the camp is secure, no wandering off alone, and most importantly, stay close to the fire. The stars had begun to dot the sky above, and the fire's glow was the only light for miles. Despite the warnings, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He stared into the flickering flames, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing in on him. It was then that the quiet first took hold. Not the kind of silence you expect in the woods, but an unsettling hush that seemed to stretch through the camp, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. But the scouts didn't notice. For them, it was just another night in the wilderness. They had no way of knowing that the peace of this night would be the last for many of them. The next day, they would be gone, lost to the forest, with no trace of where they had gone or why. And what was waiting for them deep in the heart of the wilderness had no intention of letting them return. The morning broke over the forest with a strange stillness. The sky was a washed-out blue, clouded with an early fog that clung to the ground like a blanket. The camp was still, save for the soft rustling of the trees as the wind began to stir. The scouts, bleary-eyed from the cold night, slowly began to wake. There was no rush. They had the whole day ahead of them, just another day in the woods. The fire from the night before had long since died out, leaving behind only embers and the remnants of charred wood. Aaron stretched his arms, his muscles sore from the hike yesterday. His pack was still neatly by his side, and the smell of wet earth was already rising with the morning fog. He shuffled over to the edge of the camp, where a few other scouts were already gathering firewood. The stillness of the morning hadn't shaken from him the feeling of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, but something about the woods felt different. Today, the air was too thick, too quiet. He couldn't pinpoint what was off, but every time his eyes scanned the horizon, his pulse quickened. Scoutmaster Collins was already on his feet, calling for everyone to gather around the campfire to discuss the day's plans. His voice, steady and commanding, helped bring some semblance of order to the group. The scouts gathered around, forming a loose circle, the fog curling around their legs like an omen. "All right, team," Collins began. "Today we're hiking deeper into the forest. I've mapped out a new trail. We'll head east and stop for lunch by the river, then return here by nightfall." He paused, scanning the group. "Stay together. The forest may seem calm, but things can change fast out here. No one should wander off. Got it?" The scouts nodded, some more enthusiastically than others, their packs already slung over their shoulders. The mood was one of routine. This was just another day in the wilderness. They didn't know that the trail ahead would mark the beginning of the end of their journey. The hike started like any other. The air was damp, and the fog clung to the trees in a way that made the world seem dim and distant. The trail they followed was narrow, cutting through dense foliage. The scouts, now more accustomed to the forest's eerie stillness, laughed and joked among themselves as they hiked. They were used to the sounds of birds and the occasional rustling of squirrels, but today the silence felt deeper. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional snap of a twig. By mid-morning, they had covered a fair distance, but as the group continued forward, something odd happened, something no one could immediately explain. The radio, which Collins had been using to check in with the ranger station, suddenly crackled and went dead. He frowned, twisting the dial as he tried to get a signal, but all that came through was static. "Must be some interference," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He attempted to call the station again, but the signal wouldn't return. The forest swallowed the sound of his voice, leaving only silence in its wake. Collins was no stranger to the unpredictable nature of the wilderness, but even he felt a creeping sense of unease. He checked the time on his watch. Nearly noon. They should have been able to get a clear signal, especially in the middle of the day. He didn't mention his worries to the group. He didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. The scouts were too caught up in the hike to notice. Aaron, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The air had a strange weight to it, almost as though it was holding its breath. He glanced over at Daniel, but his friend was lost in conversation with another scout, laughing about something. The others were equally distracted, chatting and pointing out animal tracks or trying to spot birds in the trees. Collins called. A break at the riverbank as planned, and the scouts sat in the damp grass, resting and eating their packed lunches. He once again tried the radio, but there was nothing. The static hissed in his ears like an angry, unseen presence. His face hardened as he clicked off the radio, slipping it back into his pack. "We'll head back to camp soon," Collins said, his tone not quite as light as before. "Stick to the trail. Don't stray off. We'll make it back before sunset." The scouts nodded, but no one noticed the way Collins' eyes lingered on the trees, the way his fingers kept brushing against the compass at his waist. No one heard the soft crackling of leaves behind them, nor the strange chill that had begun to hang in the air. The silence deepened, and though the day carried on, it felt as if something had already changed in the woods. They didn't know it yet, but their journey had taken a turn into the unknown. The hike back to camp began without much fanfare, the scouts moving at a steady pace, unaware that the forest had shifted around them. The fog had burned off, but the trees still towered above, their branches swaying with the breeze. The trail was familiar, and for a while it felt like any other hike they'd taken before. The sound of boots crunching through the dry leaves beneath them was the only noise to break the thick silence. But as they walked, something felt off, like they were being watched. Aaron couldn't place it. His senses were heightened, his mind racing, but when he glanced at Daniel, his friend only offered him a reassuring smile. It was the same smile he always wore, that easy confidence that made Aaron feel out of place. Despite his unease, Aaron tried to focus on the path ahead, determined not to let his imagination run wild. The others seemed unfazed by the stillness, lost in conversation or daydreaming as they hiked. It wasn't until they rounded a sharp bend in the trail that Collins, who had been leading the group, came to an abrupt halt. The scouts, one by one, came to a stop behind him. Collins' expression was unreadable as he knelt down, carefully inspecting the ground. "Everyone, stay back," he instructed, his voice calm but firm. The scouts obeyed. Curiosity piqued. Collins motioned for a few of the older scouts to come forward, signaling them to take a closer look. Aaron, still feeling the weight of something unseen pressing in on him, stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. There, just off the main trail, were a set of tracks. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable, just a few impressions left in the dirt and fallen leaves. But upon closer inspection, the tracks were unsettlingly deep, as if something heavy had passed through. They weren't human tracks, nor did they belong to any known animal. They were too wide, too long. Something about them was wrong. "Those weren't here this morning," Collins muttered, his brow furrowing. "I would have noticed." The group fell silent. The tracks seemed to stretch on for a while, disappearing into the dense underbrush, then curving sharply away. From the trail, they weren't the kind of tracks you would expect to see in the forest, not from any deer or bear or even a wild boar. They were more deliberate, more purposeful. Could it be another hiker? Daniel asked, his voice tense. Maybe someone else is out here. Collins shook his head. There's no way another group would have passed through here without us hearing them. These tracks don't make sense. Aaron felt his stomach turn. He didn't know why, but something about the tracks unsettled him. The way they meandered through the brush, never following the usual animal paths, was enough to make his skin prickle. He glanced at the trees around them, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. But there was nothing, no movement in the woods, just the unsettling silence that had settled over the forest. Collins stood up, motioning for the scouts to gather around. All right, everyone, listen up. We're not going to follow these tracks. I don't like it, and I don't want anyone wandering off into the woods. We'll stay on the trail. We'll head back to camp. There was a collective nod of agreement, but the tension in the air was palpable. The scouts resumed their hike, but the unease that had settled over the group was impossible to shake. They kept glancing back over their shoulders, half expecting to see something following them, though they could never quite put a finger on what it was. The rest of the hike back to camp was slower than before. The air seemed heavier, and the path felt longer. With every step, the rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot sounded louder than they ever had before. It wasn't until they reached the edge of camp that the feeling of dread finally seemed to lessen, but only slightly. Collins did a quick head count, making sure everyone was accounted for. No one had strayed. "All right," Collins said, forcing a smile. "We're back. Let's get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." But the rest didn't come easily. No one said it aloud, but the unease lingered in the corners of their minds, clinging to the edges of their thoughts. As the campfire flickered and the last of the sunlight faded away, Aaron couldn't shake the image of those tracks, how they had led off into the woods with no explanation. And no matter how many times he told himself it was nothing, he couldn't escape the feeling that the forest had something more in store for them than they could ever have imagined. The following morning, the town of Forest Glen awoke to the heavy silence of uncertainty. For weeks, the streets had buzzed with sporadic updates, false leads, and unanswered questions. The air was thick with worry, and the once vibrant energy of the town seemed to have been drained, leaving behind only the hollow sound of residents whispering in corners and watching news reports that offered little hope. At the town hall, a meeting was called at 9 a.m. sharp, but the room was already filled with anxious faces. Family members of the missing scouts had gathered, their eyes swollen from sleepless nights, their hands trembling as they clutched old photographs, waiting for news. The room buzzed with a quiet desperation, the kind that only comes from losing someone without a trace. Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters stood together in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones, hoping for something, anything, that would offer them a shred of comfort. Detective Sarah Ward, who had been leading the investigation, sat at the front of the room, her posture stiff and tired. She'd been working non-stop, piecing together the few scraps of evidence they had, but the more she worked, the more she realized how little they truly knew. The woods were vast, the trail was long, and with every passing day the possibility of finding the scouts alive grew smaller. "We've covered every inch of the forest within a 10-mile radius," she began, her voice hoarse from days of endless briefings. "Search and rescue teams have scoured the area, and we've found nothing. No sign of the bus, no tire tracks, no clues left behind. It's as though they just vanished." A gasp echoed through the room, but the detective continued, her eyes scanning the crowd. "We've spoken to witnesses, retraced their steps, and contacted all nearby campsites. No one has seen them. There's no record of any other hikers or campers in the area at the time. It's as if the forest has swallowed them whole." Lacey Monroe's mother, Irene, sat near the front, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since the meeting started, But the worry in her eyes was clear. Lacey was her only child, the one she had poured every ounce of hope and love into. The thought that her daughter, the shining star of the town, might be gone without a trace seemed impossible. Yet here she sat, waiting, praying. "Do you have any idea where they could have gone?" Irene finally asked, her voice shaky but insistent. "You said there were no tracks, no signs. What if they got lost? What if they're just out there, waiting for us to find them?" Detective Ward hesitated, her expression unreadable. "We've thought of that, Mrs. Monroe. But the truth is, nothing about this makes sense. It's as if they disappeared into thin air. We've looked at every possibility. A crash, foul play, natural disaster, even the possibility that they left on their own. But there's no sign of anything. It's like they just stopped existing." The silence in the room deepened, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a storm cloud, suffocating everything in its path. Outside, the town had begun to rally together, organizing search parties that stretched into the distant woods. Volunteer groups, local trackers, and even hired helicopters flew over the dense forest, hoping to find something that would lead them to the scouts. But the woods offered no answers, only endless, empty trees and the sound of their footsteps, being swallowed by the earth. Back at Town Hall, the sheriff's office had set up a hotline for tips and leads, but most of the calls had been of no help. Pranks, wrong numbers, and the occasional rumor. Still, the phones rang constantly, each call a faint hope that someone had seen something or had some new information. By mid-afternoon, the town's desperation had reached a breaking point. Frantic families began to take matters into their own hands, organizing a march to the forest, hoping to somehow stumble upon the missing scouts. But even as they rallied, the sheriff's office advised against it, warning that more people in the woods would only complicate the search. "Everyone is doing the best they can," Sarah Ward said to the room, trying to offer some semblance of comfort. "But at this point, we need to be realistic. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they're alive." Her words were met with more silence, but it wasn't the kind that followed after a conversation. It was the kind of silence that filled the room when hope had begun to fade. The silence of a town holding its breath, unsure whether to give up or keep fighting, unsure if there was anything left to fight for. Irene Monroe stood up, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "We won't stop looking," she said firmly, the words cutting through the quiet like a blade. "We won't stop until they're home." The days stretched on, each one blending into the next, as the search for the missing scouts continued with no results. The forest, vast and unyielding, remained silent. The helicopters that flew overhead, the search dogs that sniffed through the underbrush, and the hundreds of volunteers combing every inch of the woods seemed to be moving in a world of their own, unable to pierce the stillness that hung over the place. The deeper into the forest they searched, the quieter it became. The sounds of the town, of people speaking and breathing, of life moving forward, seemed to fade into a distant memory. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed everything. Every voice, every hope, every prayer. The air was thick, heavy, and each step deeper into the wilderness felt more like a step further away from everything they knew. Sarah Ward stood at the edge of the forest, her eyes fixed on the trees. It was an odd kind of quiet that unsettled her, a silence that felt too complete, too unnatural. The forest had always been a place of life, full of birds calling to one another, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the chirping of insects. But now it was as though the woods had forgotten how to make sound. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping lower into the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. A cool breeze stirred the branches above, but the world around her felt muted, like the forest was holding its breath. Every so often, the sound of a distant chainsaw would cut through the stillness, but it would quickly fade, swallowed by the dense woods once again. Sarah had been through this forest countless times during her career. She had seen it change with the seasons, had learned its secrets over the years. She knew it well. But this time, it felt different. This time, something was hiding in the shadows. She glanced over at the group of searchers, a few of them scattered around her, their eyes scanning the ground for any clue, any sign. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed dirt. It was as if the scouts had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. The longer they looked, the more it seemed like they were chasing a ghost. The search team had come across similar scenes before, empty campsites, abandoned tents and possessions left behind, but nothing like this. No one could explain how the group of 15 scouts, along with 2 adult leaders, could simply disappear, without a trace. It didn't make sense. It defied every law of nature they knew. As Sarah pushed forward, the weight of the silence pressed down on her chest. She had always thought of the forest as a place of refuge, a place to breathe and escape the noise of the world. But now it felt oppressive, its quiet suffocating. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but it didn't help. The silence lingered, an unwelcome companion, surrounding her in its emptiness. The farther they ventured into the woods, the harder it became to ignore the sense of something unseen watching them, something out of place. A shadow in the periphery of her vision, an echo of movement that vanished the moment she looked, but when she turned back, there was nothing. The silence of the forest was its own kind of warning, a message that no one understood. There were no birds singing, no rustling leaves to signal the passage of animals. It was as if the entire ecosystem had gone still, as if the forest itself had closed its doors to the world. After hours of searching, the team regrouped at a small clearing, their faces tired and grim. There was nothing left to find, it seemed. No sign of the scouts, no clue as to where they had gone, or what had happened. The wilderness had swallowed them whole. Sarah stood alone for a moment, her back to the others, staring at the trees that seemed to stretch on forever. She had been trained to handle these situations, to remain focused and rational. But now, as the wind picked up again and the sun dipped below the horizon, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them in the depths of the forest, something that didn't want to be found. She turned back toward the searchers, gathering her strength. There was still hope, still a chance. But the longer they searched, the more Sarah felt that the forest's silence wasn't an absence of sound, but something far more sinister. A warning that, if ignored, could cost them everything. The nights in Forest Glen had grown longer. The silence of the woods, now accompanied by an unease that had settled over the town like a dense fog. The search parties had been out for days, some for weeks, scouring the dense woods with no signs of the missing scouts, no footprints or clues to follow. Every lead they chased turned cold, like they were always one step behind something, just out of reach. The hope that they'd find the group alive had begun to fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread. For Detective Sarah Ward, the frustration was palpable. She had spent countless hours reviewing the search reports, the testimonies of the few who'd been near the area when the scouts vanished. Everyone had heard something different, but nothing had fit together. The woods, once so familiar to her, had become a labyrinth of uncertainty. She had always trusted her instincts, but now, with the chilling absence of sound hanging over her, those instincts seemed less like guidance and more like the whispers of something she couldn't quite understand. Sarah stood in the clearing, just outside the edge of the forest, her eyes scanning the distant trees as she tried to shake off the unease. The sun had already dipped behind the hills, and the forest was bathed in shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The air had become thick, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves. It felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came from peace. It was the silence of something waiting to happen. It wasn't until later that night, as she sat in the town hall going over the latest search reports, that she first heard the whispers. They were faint, barely audible, like a conversation carried on the wind. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, exhaustion creeping in, but when she leaned in, trying to catch the words, they grew louder. The whispers didn't come from outside. They came from the depths of the forest. She stood, moving quickly toward the door, her heart beating faster in her chest. As she stepped outside, the evening air hit her cool and damp, but the whispers were still there, floating just beyond her reach. The sound seemed to come from all around her, sinuous, indistinct, like 1,000 voices murmuring in the dark. Sarah scanned the trees, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no movement. The forest was still as it had been for days. She wasn't alone. A few other officers had stepped outside to join her, sensing something unusual in the air. They exchanged uncertain glances, all of them aware of the creeping dread that seemed to fill the night. The whispers grew clearer, now forming a pattern, just enough to make them feel like they were being pulled into something they couldn't quite grasp. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. One of the officers, Mark, nodded slowly, his face pale. "I hear it. What is that?" "It sounds like voices," she said, her words catching in her throat. "But it's not coming from anyone out here." They stood together, straining their ears to catch more of the sound, but the wind shifted, and the voices suddenly stopped. Silence descended on the clearing again, as if the forest had sealed itself off. Once more, "What the hell is going on?" Mark muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. Sarah shook her head, but deep down, she knew something was happening in the forest, something that none of them could explain. She had been a part of many investigations in her career, had dealt with missing persons, disappearances, and unsolved cases, but this was different. The forest felt alive in a way that didn't sit right with her. It felt like it was holding its own secrets, things that only it knew and had no intention of sharing. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of them lingered, filling the air. With a sense of foreboding, Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She had heard the voices, and she knew they weren't a product of her imagination. The forest wasn't silent. It had simply been waiting for someone to listen, and now Sarah realized the woods were beginning to speak. But whether they would share the truth or only lead them deeper into the darkness, she couldn't yet tell. The morning fog still lingered when the team gathered at the edge of the woods. The sense of urgency had become a familiar weight in the pit of Sarah Ward's stomach. The search had grown desperate. Days turned into weeks, and the relentless effort to find any trace of the missing scouts had led to nothing until now. It was early, the light dim and washed out by the thick mist, but the air was heavy with expectation. Another search team had stumbled upon something that might finally bring the answers they so desperately needed. But Sarah could feel a sense of foreboding creeping over her as they walked deeper into the woods. The whispers from the previous night still echoed in her mind, and though she tried to push them aside, the unease was unshakable. The forest felt like it was watching them, listening. As the team moved through the underbrush, the first sign of something unusual appeared. Broken branches scattered across the ground, their angles too sharp, too deliberate to be the result of an animal's passing. Sarah's hand tightened around the strap of her pack as they moved forward. The silence, hanging thick around them, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs beneath their feet. It wasn't long before they saw it. A clearing opened up ahead, and the unmistakable sight of tents came into view. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she took in the sight of the abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, the ashes long extinguished. The tents, though, were still standing, empty, silent, and untouched by the passage of time, as if the scouts had simply stepped away and never returned. "Over here!" one of the officers called, pointing toward the remains of the campsite. Sarah's stomach turned. This wasn't like the other campsites they'd found. This one was different. The tents were arranged in a neat circle, the way a group of friends would set up their camp, yet everything around them felt wrong. There were no signs of life, no footprints in the dirt, no indication of a struggle. It was as though the scouts had just disappeared in the middle of their day, leaving everything behind without a trace. She approached the nearest tent cautiously, her boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath her. The fabric was weathered, its edges frayed by time, but it was still intact. Inside, there were no signs of panic. A sleeping bag lay neatly rolled up, a flashlight, a few scattered items of clothing, and a partially eaten snack, nothing that suggested the kind of chaos that should have followed a group of missing people. It was eerily still. "Sarah," one of the officers called, his voice tense. She turned to see him standing a few feet away, staring down at something in the dirt. She stepped over quickly, her heart in her throat. The officer was crouched next to a small pile of objects, scout badges, a notebook, and a handful of Polaroid photographs, all arranged in a neat circle, as though someone had placed them there with intention. It was unnatural. It felt wrong. "Why would they leave these?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She crouched down next to the officer, picking up one of the photographs. The faces of the missing scouts stared back at her, frozen in time, smiling, unaware of the horror that would unfold. She could feel the weight of their absence, the sense that something had been left behind. This wasn't just an abandoned camp, it was a message. Sarah stood, her gaze sweeping over the rest of the site, and her eyes fell on the edge of the camp, where the ground was disturbed. It looked like a path had been trampled down, leading deeper into the woods, but there were no signs of struggle, no broken branches or trampled foliage. The path, if you could call it that, simply led off, into the trees, swallowed by the thickening shadows. "Where did they go?" Sarah muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with frustration. The officer next to her stood up, dusting off his knees. "There's no sign of them leaving in any direction. It's like they just vanished." Sarah looked back at the camp, her eyes narrowing. They didn't leave, not on their own at least. Something's not right. The team began to spread out, investigating further, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. She looked down again at the circle of objects, at the photographs of the smiling scouts, and something inside her shifted. It was clear now. This wasn't just an abandoned camp. It was a carefully constructed scene left for them to find. The forest had a secret, and she had a sinking feeling that whatever it was waiting for them to uncover it. The forest was beginning to darken as the hours passed, the trees casting long, stretching shadows over the abandoned campsite. The air was growing cooler, but the weight of the discovery felt even heavier. Sarah Ward stood at the edge of the camp, staring at the items left behind, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet answer. How could the scouts have disappeared without a trace? Why had they left their belongings behind so meticulously? And why, of all places, had they arranged their items like an offering or a message? The team had continued their search through the area, checking every nook and cranny for clues, but nothing seemed to make sense. The tracks from earlier, the ones that had been so carefully hidden from view, now seemed to be mocking them. Whoever, or whatever, had taken the scouts had clearly planned every step. Sarah could feel the dread creeping up her spine, her gut telling her that something far darker was at play here than a simple disappearance. She moved back toward the center of the camp where the officers had started to gather the scattered belongings. The photographs and badges had been left in neat, deliberate piles, but it was the small, worn notebook that caught her eye. It lay partially open, as if someone had hastily shoved it back into place. Sarah knelt down and gingerly picked it up, flipping through the pages with caution. The writing was erratic, scribbled hastily in a way that made it clear whoever had written it had been under extreme duress. The last entry was just a few lines, barely legible, as if the person writing had run out of time. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she read the words, "They're here. We didn't leave. They won't let us go." She felt a cold shiver race down her spine. The ink seemed to bleed into the paper, almost as if the words were alive, clawing at her, begging for attention. She flipped back through the pages, but the rest was barely readable. The handwriting had become more frantic, disjointed, the words beginning to lose their coherence. "They're here," Sarah repeated softly, her voice a mere whisper. Who were they? And what did they mean by "won't let us go"? The questions swirled in her mind, growing more tangled with each passing second. She stood, clenching the notebook in her hand, and turned to the officer standing nearest to her. "Get this back to the station," she said, her voice steadier. Then she felt, "We need to have this analyzed right away. It's a message, I know it." The officer nodded, his face grim, and moved off toward the camp's edge, where the rest of the team had gathered, preparing to head back. Sarah stood in the center of the camp, taking in the surroundings once more, her thoughts racing. Just as she was about to turn to leave, something caught her eye, something that hadn't been there before. She walked slowly toward the far edge of the camp, where the trees grew thicker. There, almost hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves and debris, was a small object partially buried in the dirt. It was a boot, one of the scout boots, its sole worn from wear, its lace half undone, as though it had been abandoned in a rush. Her breath caught in her throat. She bent down, carefully brushing the dirt away, revealing more of the boot. But, as she did, her hand froze. Beneath it, tangled in the laces, was a fragment of something far worse, a human tooth. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pulled the boot completely free from the earth. There was no mistaking it now. The tooth was unmistakably human. Her mind raced, her stomach turning as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. It was small, too small to belong to an adult, and as her eyes traced the boot, she realized there was something else hidden just beneath the surface of the earth. A bone, pale and broken. A bitter realization gnawed at her insides. Whoever had been here, whoever had arranged this scene, wasn't just hiding the scouts. They were leaving behind pieces, clues to something much darker than anyone could have prepared for. The discovery of the tooth hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a final, bitter confirmation that the missing scouts weren't just lost. They had been taken, or worse, trapped. "Sarah, we need to go," one of the officers called out from the far side of the camp. His voice was tight, filled with urgency. Sarah looked up, her hand still trembling as she gripped the boot. She wasn't ready to leave. She couldn't leave. There was something in these woods, something hidden just beyond her reach, and it was waiting for them all to uncover its truth. But as she stood there, holding the boot in her hand, she knew it wasn't just the forest that was watching them. It was the thing that had taken the scouts, and it was still out there. The sky had darkened by the time the team made their way toward the far edge of the campsite, where the fire pit had been carefully concealed by layers of leaves and debris. Sarah Ward led the way, her footsteps steady despite the gnawing unease that had taken root deep inside her. She had seen many strange things during her career as a detective, but nothing like this. The camp was wrong in so many ways. Too perfect, too planned, like someone had intentionally staged it all. Now, with the bone and the mysterious writings, it was clear whatever had happened to the scouts was not an accident. The fire pit, when they finally reached it, was unlike any Sarah had seen in her years of investigating. It was small and shallow, with jagged stones arranged in a tight circle, almost as if it had been hastily constructed. The stones were blackened and charred, but not from the usual campfire burn. The marks were too deep, the char too complete. There was something unnatural about it. The air around the fire pit felt thick, as if it had been absorbing the heat for much longer than it should have. Sarah crouched down to get a better look, the glow of the lantern casting long, unsettling shadows across the clearing. The ground around the pit was disturbed, as if someone or something had recently stood there, pacing in a restless, erratic pattern. The earth was pressed down in strange, uneven patches, the kind of marks made when someone or something had been there for a prolonged time, but not in a casual way. Sarah's eyes flickered to the edges of the fire pit, where small remnants of burnt wood and paper clung to the stone. As she leaned closer, she saw what looked like the corner of a page, dark and curled, partially disintegrated by the flames. Carefully she reached in and pulled it free, her heart racing as she tried to flatten the brittle paper. It was an old page from a notebook, stained with soot and ash, but the ink was still legible. The writing was familiar, she recognized it immediately. The same frantic, hasty handwriting from the notebook they had found earlier. This time, the message was clearer, the words more coherent, but no less disturbing. We're not alone. They want us. They won't let us leave. The words sent a chill down her spine, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. Who were they? And why hadn't anyone told them the truth? What do you think this means? One of the officers asked quietly, standing behind Sarah. He sounded almost afraid to voice the question aloud, as if saying it would make it real. I don't know, Sarah murmured, not taking her eyes off the page. But it's clear now. Whatever happened to these kids, it wasn't an accident. They were lured here, trapped maybe, and someone or something made sure they never left. The officer stepped forward, his flashlight beams sweeping across the pit. As he did, Sarah noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. Scattered around the fire pit were small, jagged shards of what looked like bone, crushed and burnt to the point of being unrecognizable. They were mixed in with the ashes and charred wood, as though they had been thrown into the fire, but the pieces weren't from the scouts. They were older, worn and darkened with age. Those don't belong to the scouts, Sarah whispered. The officer looked at the fragments, his face paling. What is this place? Sarah stood up, the fire pit now seeming even darker, as though the flames had never fully died. I don't know, she said again, her voice tinged with disbelief. But I think we're getting closer to understanding what's really going on here. The surrounding trees seemed to close in around them, the once familiar woods now heavy with a sense of foreboding. She looked around the camp again, her eyes scanning the space. Every piece of evidence, every clue, seemed to point toward one thing. They were being drawn deeper into something that had been hidden for years, something that wasn't finished yet. Sarah turned to the officer and gestured for him to gather. The rest of the team. Get the others, she ordered. We need to search this area more thoroughly. If there's one thing I'm sure of, it's that we've only scratched the surface. As the officer nodded and moved off, Sarah lingered for a moment longer, staring at the fire pit. She felt the weight of the mystery bearing down on her, the sense that the forest had more to reveal than she was prepared for. She had seen darkness before, cases that seemed impossible to solve, lives lost in ways that defied explanation. But this was different. This was something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. This was something that would take everything. They had to understand, and even then it might never be fully revealed. The fire pit was only the beginning, and Sarah knew, with chilling certainty, that the forest still had secrets it wasn't ready to share. The evening air had settled into an uneasy quiet, and the searchers had returned to their camp for the night. The discovery of the fire pit had left everyone on edge, and the officers had spent hours combing through the surrounding area, but they hadn't found anything else of significance. Sarah Ward had expected more answers, but instead it felt like they had uncovered only another layer of the mystery, something that was more unsettling than reassuring. Sarah sat alone by the edge of the campfire, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what they had found. The camp, the notebook, the strange writings, the bones. It was all starting to form a picture, but the picture wasn't one she was ready to see. The feeling that they were being watched, that they were being drawn deeper into something they didn't understand, weighed heavily on her. But there was no time to dwell on it. They needed answers, and fast. Just as she was about to call it a night, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She fumbled for it, her heart racing at the possibility of new information. She swiped the screen, the name on the caller ID making her stomach drop. Jared Fields, Sarah muttered under her breath, a knot forming in her chest. He was the only survivor of the scout troop, the only one who had been found after their disappearance. But he had never been able to give a clear account of what had happened in the woods. His story had been erratic, full of gaps and contradictions, and he had been kept in protective custody ever since. Sarah had wondered if he would ever speak again, if he would ever give them the answers they so desperately needed. She answered the phone, her voice calm, but tinged with suspicion. Jared. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment Sarah thought the call had dropped. Then a voice, hoarse and trembling, whispered through the static. "They're still out there." Jared's voice was barely audible, as though he was speaking from the depths of some dark place. "I wasn't supposed to call you, but you have to listen. You're getting too close." Sarah's pulse quickened, and she gripped the phone tighter. "Jared, where are you? What do you mean? They're still out there." The silence stretched, and she could almost hear Jared's labored breathing, as if he was struggling to speak. "The forest isn't just trees and dirt," he said, his voice shaky. It's not what you think. It's alive. It listens. It knows you're there, and it doesn't want you to find the truth." Sarah's mind reeled. "What truth, Jared? What happened to the others? Where are they?" A jagged breath crackled through the phone. "I can't tell you everything. I don't know how much longer I have." Jared's voice trailed off, his words slurring as if he was fading into delirium. "But they took them. All of them. They weren't just lost. They were chosen. You have to stop looking, Sarah. They won't let you leave once. You know, they're waiting for you." The line went dead. For a long moment, Sarah just stood there, staring at the phone in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of her own breathing felt too loud, too real, in the silence that followed. She had heard the desperation in Jared's voice, the fear that had never been there before. Whatever had happened to the scouts, whatever had happened to Jared, was much darker than she had ever imagined. "They took them," she whispered to herself, the words hanging in the air like a curse. They were chosen. Her mind raced as she tried to process what Jared had said. Chosen. What did that mean? And what truth was he talking about? Jared had always been a source of confusion. His story about the commune in the woods, the rituals, the things he claimed to have seen, had never fully made sense. But now, the pieces were beginning to fit together in a way that made her blood run cold. Someone, or something, had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. The fire pit, the bones, the strange drawings. It was all leading back to the same place. But what had Jared meant by their waiting for you? What were they waiting for? Sarah stood, her mind made up. She wasn't going to stop until she had the answers. The truth, no matter how dark or twisted, had to be found. And if Jared was right, if they were being watched by something unseen, then she and the rest of the team needed to be ready for whatever was out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest. The search wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The air was thick with tension as Sarah and the team pressed deeper into the woods. The days had blurred into one another, each one marked by frustration and dread, and the discovery of Jared's call had only heightened the sense of urgency. The search had intensified, but every direction they took seemed to lead them into a dead end. The forest, once a place of mystery, now felt like a maze with no exit. The longer they searched, the more it seemed as though the trees themselves were closing in around them, hiding the truth in their depths. The team had reached the point where the trail became almost impossible to follow. They had circled back to the same patch of woods they had scoured days before, but now something felt different. The forest no longer seemed simply silent. It felt oppressive, as though something unseen was pressing in on them, urging them to turn back. But Sarah couldn't do that. She had come too far. They had come across the remains of another camp. That morning, another piece of evidence that only deepened the mystery. There were signs of life there, remnants of tents and sleeping bags, but the camp had been abandoned just like the others. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just an empty space where something had happened, something that left no trace. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn toward something that had been waiting for them all along. As they trudged through the dense underbrush, Sarah's mind wandered back to Jared's cryptic words. They were chosen. What did he mean by that? Were the scouts part of something bigger, something they hadn't understood? And why had Jared seemed so terrified in his call? She had never heard him so shaken. It was as if the years of silence had finally cracked him, and he had been left with only fragments of a terrible truth. The team had split into smaller groups, each moving along a different stretch of the trail. Sarah had insisted they keep together, but the feeling that the forest was closing in on them made it hard to stay close. The path had become narrower, harder to follow, the trees growing thicker, their branches intertwining in a way that almost blocked out the sky. The feeling of disorientation was overwhelming, and Sarah found herself constantly checking her compass, making sure they hadn't wandered off course. It wasn't until they reached the edge of a dense thicket that things started to change. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence more oppressive. And then, just ahead, Sarah saw it, a break in the trees, a clearing that hadn't been there before. Her breath caught in her throat as she motioned for the others to follow. This was no ordinary clearing. The ground was disturbed, as if something large had moved through it recently. There were no tracks, no trails, but something about the way the earth was churned made it feel wrong. They stepped cautiously into the clearing, their eyes scanning the area. Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end as she took in the sight before her. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, arranged in an odd pattern, almost ritualistic. The stones were ancient, weathered by time and worn by the elements, but the shape they formed was unmistakable. It was a marker, something meant to be seen, but hidden from view. Around the circle, scattered on the ground, were pieces of torn clothing, bits of fabric that had been shredded as if by force. Sarah crouched down, inspecting the fabric closely. It was familiar, one of the scouts' uniforms. She stood up quickly, the realization hitting her hard. This was no accident. The clearing, the stones, the broken fabric, it was all a message, one they had only just begun to understand. As she scanned the area, she felt a cold rush of air, and then, for the first time since the search began, she heard something, soft but unmistakable, a whisper just beyond the trees. She strained to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the unnerving silence once again. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her team turned toward her, their faces filled with confusion and concern. They had heard nothing. She shook her head, brushing off the doubt that crept in, but she couldn't ignore the feeling. the feeling that they had just reached the edge of something far deeper than they had anticipated. The path they were on had no clear end, and every step forward seemed to take them further into the unknown. And then it happened. Just as Sarah turned to leave the clearing, her eyes locked onto something in the distance, a shadow moving between the trees, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the forest, watching them. Her heart raced. The forest wasn't silent. It was waiting. And now they had found the vanishing point, the place where everything disappeared. The figure, in the distance, seemed to flicker between the trees like a wisp of smoke, just out of reach, always moving further into the forest with every step Sarah took. The sudden appearance of the shadow, fleeting and impossible to fully track, sent a surge of cold through her veins. She stopped, motioning for the others to remain quiet, her eyes locked on the spot where she had last seen the movement. The forest around her seemed to close in, its silence oppressive. The shadows grew deeper, thicker, as though the trees themselves were leaning in, watching. There was no sound, no breeze, no rustling of leaves, no birds calling in the distance. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something. "Did you see that?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, though she knew it didn't matter. Whatever it was far beyond the reach of reason. "See what?" one of the officers asked, squinting toward the trees. He was standing just a few feet from Sarah, but there was nothing in his gaze except confusion. The others began to look around, but none of them saw the figure. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her instincts screaming at her to move, to follow, but she knew better. They couldn't afford to get separated, not now. "Stay together," she ordered. "Stay close." They moved as a group, slowly, cautiously, but the figure was gone, vanished like a dream fading when the morning light first touches it. The trees, as dense as they were, offered no more clues. No sign of movement, no trace that anyone had been there at all. The feeling of being watched lingered in the air, pressing on them, almost suffocating. The shadows between the trees seemed to grow longer, twisting in unnatural ways, as if the forest itself was hiding something. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the darkening woods, silent and still. They pressed on, the unsettling feeling growing with each step. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became. There was no clear path now, only tangled underbrush and dense trees, the kind of forest that made you feel small, insignificant, and utterly alone. A rustle in the trees ahead of them made Sarah freeze, her pulse quickening. She held up a hand, signaling for the group to stop. The rustling was faint but distinct, coming from the direction they were heading. It sounded like something or someone moving through the brush, careful but deliberate. She motioned for the team to spread out slightly, staying close enough to keep in sight of one another. They moved silently, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot and their labored breathing. The rustling stopped, replaced by another silence, deeper than before. Sarah felt as though the forest was holding its breath. Then a sharp crack echoed through the trees. It came from their right, from just beyond the next line of trees. A loud snap, like something breaking under weight. Without thinking, Sarah moved toward the sound, her instincts taking over. The others followed, hesitant but determined. They reached the spot where the noise had come from, and there, lying in the underbrush, was a torn piece of fabric, dark blue, with the unmistakable insignia of the scout troop. The fabric was stained, dirty and torn, as if it had been dragged through the forest, but there was no sign of the scout who had worn it. "God," one of the officers muttered, kneeling beside the fabric. "It's one of them." Sarah stood, still, staring at the piece of fabric in disbelief. She felt the weight of the situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. The shadows in the trees weren't just shadows. They were something else, something darker. Her mind raced back to Jared's words. They're still out there. And now, in the depths of this God-forsaken forest, Sarah realized that the thing they were hunting, the thing that had taken the scouts, wasn't just a group of people. It was something far more sinister, something that had lived in the woods for far longer than they knew. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were watching. She turned back to the group, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything they had found so far. We need to move, now. And keep your eyes open. We're not alone. The forest, once an unknown expanse, now felt like a living, breathing thing watching, waiting, and closing in on them. Whatever was out there had only just begun to show its true face. The night had come quickly, swallowing the last remnants of daylight as the group set up camp once more. The unsettling events of the day had left everyone on edge, the tension in the air palpable as they gathered around the dying embers of a fire that hadn't quite managed to keep the chill away. Sarah could see it in their eyes. Everyone was tired, exhausted from days of searching with nothing to show for it but more questions. The forest felt like it was closing in, its shadows pressing closer with every passing hour. No one spoke at first. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, a sharp contrast to the eerie silence of the woods surrounding them. Sarah pulled, her jacket tighter around her shoulders, and stared into the flames, feeling the weight of everything they had discovered so far. The fabric, the bones, the messages left behind, everything pointed to the same thing. They were hunting something, far older, far darker than they could have ever imagined. It was Daniel, one of the officers, who finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if speaking any louder might summon something from the forest. "You know," he said, his gaze flicking nervously to the trees, "this place, it feels like it has a story to tell." Sarah looked up at him, a brow raised. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking toward the fire. "I've been thinking. A lot of people talk about the woods around here, about strange things that happen, things people don't talk about too openly, you know, the stories." Another officer, Mark, spoke up, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Stories? You mean like ghost stories? This is real. People are missing and we're getting closer to finding them. We don't have time for campfire tales." But Daniel wasn't deterred. He continued, his voice quieter now, almost as if the words had to be whispered for them to be heard. "No, not just ghost stories. Real stories, things that have been here long before any of us, long before the town even started." Sarah sat up straighter, intrigued despite herself. "Go on," she said softly, her eyes locked on Daniel's face. Daniel paused, his gaze flicking to the trees again before he spoke. "There's an old story, one that's been told for generations. It's about the forest, the land we're standing on. People say it's cursed, that the forest itself has a mind of its own, that it takes what it wants when it wants. But the part that always gets to me is the one about the chosen. People talk about it in hushed tones, about groups of people who disappear, who are taken. And it's always the ones who wander too far into the heart of the woods. They say, the forest watches, waiting for them." The fire crackled again, filling the silence that followed his words. No one spoke at first, the weight of his story hanging in the air like the smoke rising from the flames. "I don't believe in that kind of stuff," Mark said after a long pause, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're dealing with a missing persons case. There's nothing supernatural going on here." "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty now. "Because every time we find something, it feels like it's just the beginning of something much worse. The fire pit, the bones, the clothing. It's like someone's been preparing for us, setting it all up. Why would someone go to all that trouble unless they wanted us to find it?" Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as Daniel's words echoed in her mind. The truth was, she couldn't explain what they had found, not any of it. There was no logical reason for the things they had discovered. And though she didn't believe in curses or ancient myths, something about this place felt undeniably wrong. "So, what are you saying?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "That we've walked into something intentional? That whoever or whatever is behind this has been planning this all along?" Daniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. I think we've been drawn in, and I think we're supposed to be here." The fire flickered as if agreeing with his words, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground, as though the forest itself was reaching out to pull them in. No one spoke for a moment. The weight of Daniel's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The feeling of being watched, of being drawn deeper into something dark and unknowable, was impossible to ignore. Then a rustling came from the trees, faint but distinct, almost like the sound of footsteps. "Did you hear that?" Mark's voice trembled slightly as he turned to look at the others. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding, but when she looked around, the forest was still, nothing but the shadows of trees stretching in every direction. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said, though her voice was uncertain. She didn't feel sure of anything anymore. The campfire crackled louder, the shadows in the trees stretching farther, and Sarah realized something in that moment. The past story was no longer just a tale, a warning from the past. It was real, and they were trapped in the middle of it. The air grew colder as the night deepened, the firelight flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. Sarah sat back down near the fire, her mind reeling from the unsettling conversation that had just taken place. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "We're supposed to be here." She couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, that they had unwittingly stepped into a game that was already in motion, a game with rules they didn't understand. The forest, which had once been merely a backdrop to their search, now felt like an active participant in the mystery, like it was aware of their every move. The others had grown quiet after Daniel's story. Mark had returned to poking at the fire, though his movements were jerky, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. The rest of the team stared into the flames, each of them lost in their own thoughts. No one spoke, but Sarah could feel the collective unease hanging in the air. She glanced around, wondering if the others were as unsettled as she was, but all she saw were shadows, shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and shifting with the light. She stood up, rubbing her arms to ward off the chill. "I'm going to take a quick walk," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She needed to clear her head, needed to feel something other than the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on her. Without waiting for a response, she walked away from the fire, moving deeper into the trees. The ground was uneven beneath. Her boots, the underbrush thick and tangled, but she pushed forward, ignoring the creeping sense of being watched. The further she went, the quieter it became, until the only sound was the soft rustle of her movements and the distant chirping of nocturnal insects. It wasn't until she reached a small clearing that she noticed it, the odd stillness. The air felt different here, thinner, as though it wasn't meant to be breathed. She paused, her senses on high alert. The clearing was empty, save for a few scattered branches and a patch of soft grass, but something about it felt wrong. A sense of foreboding clung to the space, as if it was somehow different from the rest of the forest. The trees around the clearing stood taller, their trunks wider and gnarled, as though they had witnessed centuries of change. And then she saw it. In the corner of her vision, something moved, too quickly to be a deer, too fluid to be a human. It was just a glimpse, a flash of dark movement, but it was enough to make Sarah's heart skip a beat. She whipped her head around, eyes searching the edge of the clearing, but there was nothing there. Only the still, silent trees. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step forward. The movement had been so fast, so unnatural, that it left her uncertain of what she had actually seen. Could it have been an animal, a trick of the light, or had the shadows in the trees really been watching her? Her pulse quickened, and she felt the weight of the forest closing in on her once again. The silence seemed to stretch longer this time, as though it was waiting for her to make a move. She held her breath, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the trees, the feeling of something just beyond her reach pressing in on her. And then, out of nowhere, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was there, clear and unmistakable. A whisper, almost a hum, carried on the wind. Sarah's heart lurched in her chest. The voice was too familiar. It sounded like Jared, but it couldn't be. He was miles away, back at the station, under protection. "It's too late," the voice whispered, so softly that she almost thought it was just in her mind. She turned sharply, her hand reaching for her flashlight, but the beam cut through nothing but darkness. She couldn't see anything, no movement, no figure, just the trees staring back at her with their empty, gnarled eyes. The whispers continued, as if the trees themselves were speaking to her. "Too late. They've already found you." Her blood ran cold as she took another step back, her foot catching on a root. She stumbled but caught herself, her breath coming faster now. She turned and ran, her instincts taking over as she pushed through the underbrush, her flashlight bobbing wildly in front of her. The path back to the camp was a blur in her mind, but she didn't dare stop. Whatever it was, out there, whatever she had glimpsed in the trees, it wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, not in the way she understood. By the time she reached the camp, the others were already on their feet, eyes wide with concern. But Sarah couldn't explain it. Not yet. She couldn't put into words the feeling of being marked, of having been seen by something that was never meant to be seen. The next morning dawned pale and grey, the sun struggling to break through the thick canopy of trees that seemed to swallow the light whole. Sarah hadn't slept. The events of the previous night, the shadow in the trees, the whispering voice, everything gnawed at her, kept her awake and alert, her senses heightened to the point of exhaustion. She knew one thing for sure now. They weren't just searching for missing scouts. They were searching for something else, something ancient, something that had lived in these woods long before they arrived. The camp was eerily quiet as the team packed up their gear. The usual sounds of activity, rummaging through packs, the clinking of metal, were muted, drowned out by the weight of the silence that clung to everything. The fire had burned down to embers, and even the wind seemed reluctant to blow. Sarah could see it in their faces. Her team was no longer simply working a case. They were caught in something much darker, something that none of them could fully understand. And the fear, though subtle, was there, hiding behind their professionalism. "I think we need to move faster," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the lingering dread. "The forest isn't just hiding them, it's hiding something else. We need answers, and we need them now." Mark, who had been unusually quiet since their conversation around the fire, looked up from packing his things. "What do you mean? We've been looking for days and haven't found anything solid. We're chasing shadows." "We're not." "Chasing shadows," Sarah snapped, her frustration rising. "This is more than just a missing persons case. Those kids didn't just wander off. Something or someone took them, and the longer we stay here, the more we're getting drawn into it." Daniel, who had been quiet for most of the morning, finally spoke up. His face was pale, his eyes haunted, and Sarah knew it wasn't just the exhaustion that had taken hold of him. "Sarah's right," he said softly. "I've been thinking about what I said last night. The stories, the chosen. It all feels like it's leading to something. We're not just looking for answers, we're looking for the thing that's been here all along." Sarah met his gaze, her mind racing. "And what exactly is that?" "I don't know," Daniel said, shaking his head. "But I think we're getting close, too close." The team continued packing, but the air between them had changed. There was no denying it now. Whatever had taken the scouts was still out there, and whatever was watching them from the shadows wasn't human. But the question remained, what exactly were they dealing with? By mid-morning, the team had regrouped and set off again, heading deeper into the woods, following a narrow trail that led them further from the camp. The forest was denser here, the trees so close together that their branches tangled overhead, blocking out the light completely. The air felt damp, thick with the smell of moss and decay. The silence was oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Sarah led the way, her thoughts churning as she scanned the trail ahead. Every step felt heavy, weighed down by the knowledge that they were walking into something they couldn't see, couldn't fully understand. The shadows moved with them, a constant presence lurking just beyond their reach. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, felt like it was part of a much bigger plan, one that they had unknowingly become a part of. As they moved deeper, the trees began to thin, and Sarah's pulse quickened. There at the edge of the forest was something new, a small clearing. The sight of it filled her with both relief and dread. This was no ordinary clearing. The ground was scuffed as though something had been dragged through it. In the center of the space stood a large, jagged rock, half covered in moss, its surface marred with strange, deep gouges. The team moved cautiously toward the clearing, their steps tentative. Sarah felt it then, the sensation that they were being watched. It wasn't just the trees. It was something else, something older, something aware of their presence. Mark, who crouched down beside the rock, his fingers brushing the gouges. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. "This looks deliberate." Sarah approached him, her gaze fixed on the marks. They were too clean, too precise to be the result of natural wear. They looked almost like symbols, etched into the rock with purpose. "We need to get these back to the station," Sarah said quietly, her mind already racing with the implications. These marks weren't just random, they were part of something that had been waiting for them to find it. As she turned to look at her team, she realized something else. The deeper they dug into this mystery, the more they were becoming a part of it. The shadows in the trees weren't just watching them, they were guiding them to the answers. And those answers, though terrifying, were the only way they would ever get out of this alive. The further they ventured into the forest, the more the weight of the silence pressed down on them. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but something deeper, something that made the air feel thick, heavy with unseen eyes. The trees around them stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches stretching out in unnatural angles as though trying to shield the secrets of the woods from view. Sarah led the way, her instincts sharp, but the unease in her gut had only grown stronger since their last discovery. Every step felt like they were being drawn further into the heart of something ancient and unforgiving. The land beneath them was soft, yielding to their footsteps, but it seemed to resist their progress, as though the forest itself was reluctant to let them pass. They had come to a part of the woods that Sarah had never seen before, a dense, almost impenetrable thicket, where the trees grew so close together that they blocked out most of the sky. The underbrush was thick with brambles and vines, the ground uneven and soft with moss. The scent of decay lingered in the air, sharp and unmistakable. It was the scent of something long forgotten, something that had been left to rot in the shadows. "There's something wrong with this place," Mark said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it. It's like the forest is alive." Sarah didn't need him to say it. She could feel it too, the oppressive presence, the sense that the forest was holding them captive, keeping them from the truth. But she couldn't turn back, not now. They were too close. Ahead of them, Daniel stopped, his hand raised in a gesture for the group to be still. "Look," he said, his voice barely audible. Sarah followed his gaze. Through the tangled undergrowth, she could make out something faintly shimmering, something that didn't belong in the natural world. It was a broken path, a trail through the trees that led deeper into the thicket. And at the end of that trail was something even more unsettling, a circle of stones, half buried in the dirt, as if they had been placed there deliberately and then forgotten. The stones were rough and uneven, arranged in a haphazard pattern that looked too intentional to be natural. In the center of the circle, there was a patch of earth that was disturbingly clear, the ground unnaturally bare. No vegetation grew. Here just bare soil, dark and damp, as though it had been scorched by something unseen. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against the moss and fallen leaves. The air grew heavier with each step, thickening with an ancient energy that was almost suffocating. She could feel it now, the weight of it pressing on her chest, dragging at her thoughts. She wasn't just standing in the woods, she was standing in a place of power, a place where something had happened, a place where something still lingered. "Do you feel that?" Daniel asked, his voice low and tense. "I do," Sarah replied, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stepped into the circle of stones, her heart pounding in her chest as she crouched down to examine the bare earth. There was something about this place that unsettled her to her core, something that felt older than the forest itself. Mark moved cautiously to her side, his eyes scanning the area. "I don't like this. This place feels wrong." Sarah nodded. It wasn't just the air, the unnatural stillness. It was the feeling that the forest had been here long before them, and it would remain long after they were gone. They were intruders in a place that had no room for them. Suddenly the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, though the clearing remained eerily still. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end as a low whisper echoed through the woods. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rustling of leaves, it was something else. A voice, distant but unmistakable, carried through the trees. "We're here," Sarah whispered to herself, the words chilling her to the bone. The forest had been waiting, watching, and now it was speaking. But the words weren't meant for her. They were meant for the missing scouts, for the souls of those who had disappeared. Something in the distance shifted, a dark figure moving between the trees, but when Sarah turned her head, it was gone. The forest had swallowed it whole, leaving only the echo of the voice and the oppressive silence behind. As they moved on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was no longer just a place to be searched. It had become a force, a living, breathing entity that was claiming its lost souls, one by one, and trapping them in the shadows. She wasn't sure if they were meant to find the scouts or if they were simply the next to be claimed. But one thing was certain: they were no longer alone in the woods. The forest had begun to speak, and its message was clear. They were intruders, and the price of discovery would be steep. It was just after dawn when Sarah first saw him, a figure emerging from the dense trees, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the grey light of the morning. His movements were deliberate, measured, as though he had been walking this path for years, though Sarah knew he was a stranger to this part of the forest. The man was tall, rugged, with a weathered face that had seen far more than its fair share of hardship. His clothes were faded, his boots worn to the point of needing replacement, but his eyes, those piercing, cold eyes, never wavered. He moved with the kind of confidence that only came from experience, and it was clear from the way he scanned the camp that he knew exactly what he was doing. "Who is that?" Mark asked quietly, his voice laced with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She had seen trackers like him before, hunters, guides, people who lived in the wilderness, people who were as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves. She had heard rumors about a man who had once helped the local authorities track down missing persons in these very woods, but she had never met him. Until now. The man approached the campfire, his eyes now focused on Sarah. There was no hint of surprise in his expression, no need for introduction. He simply stepped forward and spoke. "Sarah Ward," he said, his voice low, gravelly, as if the forest itself had stolen the warmth from his words. "I've been following your trail." She stood up, her hand instinctively moving to the sidearm she carried, though she knew the man wasn't a threat. Not yet. He had an aura of quiet authority, one that didn't need to be declared. "And you are?" Sarah asked, her voice guarded but steady. "Caleb Reeve," he replied, offering a slight nod. "I've been tracking in these woods for a long time. I know them better than anyone else in this town. When the word got out about the missing scouts, I figured I'd be the one to find them." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her instincts telling her that he wasn't here to waste time. She had heard his name before, a former tracker who had disappeared from the public eye for years. The rumors had said he was too good, too obsessed with the forest's mysteries to be trusted with conventional law enforcement. But Sarah wasn't one to judge based on rumors. Not anymore. "We could use someone who knows this land," Sarah said finally, motioning for him to sit by the fire. "We're not getting anywhere on our own." Caleb sat down, his posture relaxed, but his gaze never left the tree line. It was as if he was listening to something Sarah couldn't hear, sensing something just out of sight. "I've been out here looking for them too," he said, his tone distant. "What you're chasing, it's not what you think. There's something else in these woods, something that doesn't want to be found. And it's been here long, before your scouts ever walked in." Sarah's stomach tightened at his words. She had suspected as much. Everything they had uncovered so far pointed to something far darker than a simple disappearance. But hearing it confirmed by someone who had spent so many years in the woods made it feel all the more real. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "The thing that's taking them." Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a worn notebook, its edges frayed and the pages yellowed with age. He opened it slowly, revealing a series of sketches, strange symbols, crude drawings of figures and animals that looked almost human, yet not quite. "These," he said, flipping through the pages. "I've been tracking these signs for years. They come in cycles, always the same pattern. And every time it happens, people vanish, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. But they always vanish." Sarah looked at the drawings, the hair on the back of her neck rising. She had seen similar symbols in the clearing, etched into the stone. It was the same thing, the same patterns. "What is it? What's doing this?" she asked, her voice low, tinged with fear. Caleb's eyes met hers, the weight of his gaze, like a warning. "The forest," he said quietly. "The forest claims them. It claims anyone who strays too far, anyone who's drawn to it. You're not just searching for your missing people, Sarah. You're searching for the heart of something that doesn't want you to find it." His words hung in the air like a dark prophecy, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. The hunt had never been about finding the scouts. It had been about uncovering something much older, much more dangerous. And they were getting too close. The forest seemed to press in on them, suffocating every breath, as Sarah and the team followed Caleb deeper into the wilderness. They had spent days combing the area, following a trail that was becoming more fragmented with each step. But Caleb, with his weathered knowledge of the land, had led them to this, an ancient part of the forest that felt untouched by time. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches twisted like fingers reaching out to pull them in. It was darker here, even in the daylight, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Caleb moved ahead with a quiet urgency, his eyes scanning the trees, his every step deliberate. Sarah, despite the growing unease in her chest, stayed close behind. Him, her instincts telling her that they were nearing something important. Something they weren't ready to understand, but would have to face nonetheless. They reached the edge of a small clearing, where the trees parted enough to let in a sliver of sunlight. In the center of the space was something that sent a shiver through Sarah's entire body, an altar of sorts, built from massive stones that had been arranged in a perfect circle. The stone slabs were old, worn by centuries of exposure to the elements, but their surface was smooth, almost unnaturally so. As Sarah stepped closer, she noticed the markings etched into the stone, symbols she had seen before in the drawings Caleb had shown her. These were not the marks of any known civilization. They were something older, something primal, but it wasn't the altar that caught her attention most. It was the figure standing near it, a man, or something resembling a man, standing motionless. In the center of the circle, his back was to them, but even from a distance, Sarah could tell that there was something wrong with him. He was too still, too unnatural. The way his body seemed to almost blend into the shadows made him appear as though he was part of the forest itself. "Who is that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaky as he stepped forward, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. Caleb's voice, low and steady, cut through the tension. "That," he said, his tone betraying a trace of fear, "is the one who's been taking them. That's what you've been looking for." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The figure turned. Slowly, his face hidden in shadow, but as he stepped forward, the light caught his features. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were dark, almost completely black, with no iris to speak of. His lips were thin, stretched in a grin that didn't quite match the cold emptiness in his gaze. It was then that Sarah realized what they were looking at. This wasn't just a man. It was something else, something far older than anything they had ever encountered. He wasn't human, not entirely. He was something the forest had claimed, something that had lived in its depths for centuries, perhaps longer. "This is the forest's guardian," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who ensures the balance. It's not just the scouts it takes. It's anyone who dares to step too far into the woods. They're drawn to it, to him, and once they're marked, they belong to the forest, to him." The figure took a step closer, and the ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was responding to his presence. A low hum began to vibrate through the air, filling the clearing with a sound that seemed to come from the very trees. The figure's mouth opened, but no sound came from it, not at first. Then slowly words formed in the air around them, as if spoken by an unseen force. "You should not have come," the voice echoed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to fill Sarah's very bones. "The forest does not forget. It claims what it needs." Sarah took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. This was the final revelation, the truth she had been chasing, but one she hadn't been prepared for. The forest wasn't simply hiding the scouts. It was consuming them, drawing them into something ancient, something alive. And now they had become part of it, part of the thing that had existed here long before they ever set foot in these woods. "You can't stop it," the figure said, his voice now a mere whisper. "The forest has spoken." For a moment Sarah stood frozen, her mind reeling. The forest had always been alive, always had a presence, but she had never imagined it could be like this, could be alive in the way the figure before her was. She realized with a sickening clarity that they were too late. They had come too far, and now the forest was ready to claim them all. "We have to leave," Sarah said urgently, her voice tight with panic. But Caleb's expression had already hardened, and his eyes reflected the same understanding that had crept into Sarah's chest. "It's too late," he murmured. "The forest doesn't let go." The figure took another step forward, and the earth seemed to tremble. Sarah knew, deep down, that there was no leaving now. They had crossed the point of no return, and the forest's hold on them was stronger than anything they could comprehend. The air had thickened, suffocating with the weight of unspoken truths. Sarah stood frozen, her heart racing in her chest. As the figure before her loomed larger, its presence consuming everything around them, the trees seemed to close in on the clearing, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, pulling them deeper into the heart of the forest. The hum from earlier had intensified, vibrating through the very soil beneath her boots, and the sky above had grown darker, as if night had come to claim them early. The figure stood motionless, its black eyes boring into her, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability. There was no escape, not from the forest, not from whatever it was that had claimed the scouts. The figure had been right. The forest had spoken. The truth that had been hidden in its shadows for centuries was now laid bare, but it was more terrifying than she could have imagined. "We're too late," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the increasing hum that surrounded them. Her words seemed to fade, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The realization hit her harder than anything else. The forest wasn't just a place of trees and dirt. It was a living entity, older than time itself, and it had its own rules, its own hunger. Caleb stood beside her, his face pale and drawn. He had warned them. He had tried to prepare them for what lay ahead. But now, standing at the center of it, with the full force of the forest bearing down on them, Sarah could see the depth of his fear. He, too, had known this moment was coming. He had spent years in the wilderness, studying the patterns, tracking the signs, but even he couldn't have known how much of the forest's secret was buried beneath the surface. The figure finally spoke, its voice a low, chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You sought the truth, and now it is yours to keep. But the forest will not release what it has claimed." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step closer. She felt the ground shift beneath her, the very earth beneath her feet, groaning as though in response to the figure's movement. The stone circle that had once seemed so distant now felt close, its jagged edges sharp against the gathering gloom. The symbols carved into the stone glowed faintly, an eerie, unholy light pulsing from them like a heartbeat. "Why?" Sarah's voice trembled, but she couldn't hold the question back. "Why are you doing this? Why take them? Why take us?" The figure's lips twisted into something that could have been a smile, but it wasn't one that brought comfort. It was a smile of finality, of a truth that had been decided long ago. "The forest claims what it desires," it said simply. "It does not question, it does not answer." As the words sank in, Sarah's mind raced. The forest claims what it desires. It wasn't about the scouts. It wasn't about them at all. The forest had drawn them in, marking them as part of a cycle, a ritual that had been going on for as long as the trees had stood. It wasn't just a hunger for the living. It was a hunger for the lost, the forgotten, the chosen. And now it had claimed them all. "Is there no way out?" Caleb's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts, the desperation in his tone mirroring the fear that had begun to rise in her chest. The figure remained silent for a long moment, its black eyes gleaming with an answer that didn't need words. The answer was in the very air around them, in the shadows that grew darker as they stood there, trapped between the past and the present. "You are already part of the forest," it finally said, the words heavy with finality. "It has marked you, it has claimed you, and now it will keep you." A shudder ran through Sarah's body, and she turned to look at her team. They stood motionless, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the same realization. They had become part of something much larger than themselves. They had become part of the forest. The figure took one final step forward, its presence almost overwhelming, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for Sarah to truly understand the gravity of what was happening. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo through the forest itself, it said, "Welcome to the forest's secret." The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She had known that they were on the edge of something terrible, but now, with the forest's truth fully revealed, she understood the terrifying reality of it. There was no escape. The forest had taken them, and it would never let them go. The forest had swallowed them whole, and Sarah could feel its grip tightening with every step they took. The air had grown thick, impossibly heavy, pressing down on her lungs, making it harder to breathe. The shadows seemed deeper now, even in daylight, as though the sun itself had abandoned them. The truth, if it had ever existed, was buried beneath the weight of the woods. They had ventured too far, crossed too many lines, and now the forest was closing in on them, drawing them deeper into its heart. The clearing was silent. The stones, ancient and jagged, stood like sentinels, their strange symbols pulsing with an eerie, faint light. Sarah had come to realize too late that the truth they had been searching for was never meant to be uncovered. The answers they sought had always been hidden, locked away in the very fabric of the forest, and now that they were on the cusp of finding them, it felt as if the earth itself was trying to erase them. "I don't think we're going to make it out," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes, once filled with determination, were now wide with fear. It was the first time Sarah had heard him sound so vulnerable. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. What could she say? The forest had taken everything from them, every question they had asked, every path they had followed, every trace they had found, had led them to this point. And now, standing at the edge of the stone circle, it was clear. There was no escape, no answers, no resolution, only the dark, hungry silence of the forest that would claim them just like it had claimed the others. The sounds of the forest seemed to dim as the realization sank in. The whispers, once a distant hum, had become deafening, echoing in Sarah's ears, their words indistinct but filled with an undeniable urgency. The trees loomed around them, their twisted branches stretching like claws, as if they, too, were reaching for something that they could never grasp. Sarah glanced around at her team, their faces drained of color, their eyes wide with the same understanding that had crept into her own chest. The forest wasn't just a place of nature, it was a living, breathing entity, and they were intruders. "They're not going to stop," Sarah said, her voice low, filled with a cold, bitter certainty. She couldn't shake the image of the missing scouts, their faces frozen in time, their smiles a memory lost to the forest. It's never going to stop. She felt the weight of the forest pressing in, its presence overwhelming, and she knew deep down that they had come too far. They had uncovered something ancient, something that had no place in the world they understood. The forest had kept its secret for centuries, and now it had claimed them all. As the shadows deepened, Sarah heard something, movement, rustling in the underbrush. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest, but when she looked, there was nothing, just the trees swaying in a wind that didn't seem to exist. It was like the forest had become alive, a living, breathing thing, and now they were part of it too. The truth that had eluded them all this time was a truth they would never truly understand. The wind began to pick up, the trees groaning under its weight, and Sarah could hear the faintest echo of voices, like whispers on the breeze. She strained to hear, but the words were indistinct, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. Suddenly, Caleb's voice cut through the silence. "Do you hear that?" Sarah turned to him, her eyes narrowing, but before she could respond, the whispering stopped. The air was still again. The forest had quieted as if it were waiting, holding its breath. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the truth was gone. The answers, The clarity, the reason, they were all lost, buried beneath the weight of the forest's silence. The truth was never meant to be found. The forest was its own secret, and Sarah realized too late that it was one she would never be allowed to uncover. She looked at her team, their faces etched with resignation, and for the first time she understood. The forest had always known what it was doing, and they were just another part of its endless cycle.